Guys, welcome back to XRP Insider Network, where we connect the dots between global macro moves and what it means for your XRP before the mainstream catches on. Let's get into it. If you clicked on this video, here's what you need to hear in the first 30 seconds. Yes, the Clarity Act is moving. Yes, the legislative calendar is compressing. But the angle that almost nobody is covering, the one that actually matters most for long-term XRP holders, is that the regulatory agencies tasked with enforcing this bill are already running implementation planning before a single final vote has been cast, before the president touches a pen, before the Senate holds its floor vote. The machinery is already in motion, and when you understand what that means structurally for digital assets and specifically for the infrastructure layer that XRP and Ripple occupy, the picture changes dramatically from what the mainstream headlines are selling you. Here's what we're walking through today. We're going to start with the institutional banking story that financial media is almost completely ignoring, because the reason the big banks have gone quiet is more telling than anything they've said publicly. Then we're going to look at what it means that the SEC and CFTC are already in implementation mode right now. Then we'll walk the exact legislative roadmap step by step so you know what to watch and in what sequence. And finally, I'll give you the one concrete signal above all others that tells you more about where this is actually headed than any press release or news headline possibly could. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to see this moment very differently than you did when you hit play. Let's start with the contrarian read that almost no one is talking about. The common belief is that this bill is just another piece of crypto legislation grinding through the Washington machine, that it'll get delayed, watered down, lose momentum somewhere in committee, and eventually fade out the way so many ambitious regulatory frameworks have faded before. That narrative isn't crazy, we've watched that movie, but here's what the people repeating that take are missing. The nature of the obstacle holding this bill back has fundamentally changed. And when the nature of an obstacle changes, the probability calculus changes with it. This is not a bill stuck at the starting gate. This is a bill approaching a finish line with a specific set of remaining gaps that are closing in real time. So what was the core sticking point? The single issue that acted as a legislative anchor throughout these negotiations came down to one question: whether exchanges and third-party platforms should be legally allowed to offer yield or staking rewards to retail customers who hold stablecoins. That sounds like a narrow technical dispute. It absolutely is not. That unresolved question made it functionally pointless to finalize every other provision in the bill, because you cannot build secondary legal architecture around a primary structural disagreement that's still open. So everything waited on that. And now there is credible reporting from people with direct visibility into the negotiations that the yield question is approaching resolution. The moment that signal reached certain Senate offices, the energy inside those rooms shifted noticeably. Lawmakers and staffers who had deliberately held back, conserving political capital, started rapidly re-engaging. Because they understand how legislative windows work, and they know they are standing inside one right now. Now here's where it gets really interesting, and this is the institutional banking angle that the financial press is almost completely sleeping on. You would expect the major banking associations to be everywhere right now. Press statements, op-eds, aggressive lobbying pushes, the full institutional machinery working overtime on a bill that redesigns the architecture of American digital finance. But they've gone quiet. And the reason they've gone quiet tells you something critically important about where the compromise language has actually landed. What reporters are hearing from bank representatives on background is that the bank's central fear has evolved. Early in this process, the dominant concern was deposit flight, the intuitive worry that stablecoins offering yield would pull retail money out of traditional bank accounts at scale. That was the existential threat scenario, and it drove enormous resistance. But that is no longer the top concern. What banks are privately wrestling with now is a more specific competitive positioning question. Who captures the most market share in this new environment, and whether large national banks end up consolidating disproportionate power while smaller community institutions get structurally left behind. Think carefully about what that shift means, because it's significant. A structural existential objection, "This product kills our deposits," is almost impossible to negotiate around. A competitive positioning objection, "This market structure disadvantages smaller players," is entirely negotiable. You can write provisions for that. You can build tiered frameworks, create infrastructure support mechanisms, design regulatory on-ramps that level the playing field. That is the kind of concern that compromise language can actually address. And that transition from one type of fear to the other is a meaningful signal that the bill is landing in workable territory for the banking sector, even if they won't say so publicly. An independent economic analysis commissioned earlier this year gave senators third-party data on the community bank question specifically. The research examined deposit stickiness, how likely customers are to actually leave their bank when a competing product offers better returns. The findings suggested community bank depositors are meaningfully less likely to chase yield than customers at large national institutions. The reason is relational. Community banks operate on embedded local relationships built over decades. That deposit base is structurally more stable than the worst-case lobbying scenarios suggested. It didn't eliminate the competitive pressure concern entirely, but it partially deflated the most catastrophic version of the community bank argument and gave senators something concrete to point to instead of just competing lobby narratives. But let me show you something most people are completely missing when they look at this story. The regulators are already moving. Officials at both the SEC and the CFTC have reportedly begun internal implementation work based on the current draft language of the Clarity Act. Not after a signature. Not after a floor vote. Now. They are building the regulatory framework in real time so that when the president signs, the rules can deploy faster than anyone in the market is currently pricing in. Regulators do not allocate internal resources, staff hours, and institutional energy to legislation they believe will die in committee. They don't run implementation prep on bills they think are going to fail. The fact that both agencies are already in this mode is one of the most significant signals in this entire story, and mainstream financial media has almost completely ignored it. Why does that matter for your XRP? Because regulatory timelines are normally 18 to 24 months after a presidential signature. If the agencies are already running their internal process before the vote, that runway compresses dramatically, and for a market that prices in narrative before it prices in fundamentals. Where capital moves on anticipation and expectation, not just confirmed reality, a compressed regulatory timeline is an enormous structural development. The repricing doesn't happen when the rules go live. It happens when the market understands the rules are coming faster than expected. That's the window you're sitting in right now. Now let's get concrete on the legislative roadmap because this is where sequence matters. The House already passed its version of the Clarity Act in July of last year. On the Senate side, there are two tracks that have to merge. The CFTC regulatory piece advanced through the Senate Agriculture Committee in late January, passing on a party line vote. That portion is done at the committee level. The SEC side language, the 278-page Senate Banking Committee bill, is the piece still in active negotiation, with the key figures being Senator Tillis, Senator Ossoff Brooks, and the White House legislative team. Here is the fastest plausible path. Step 1 is a Senate Banking Committee markup session, where members formally debate, amend, and vote on whether to advance the bill. The committee chairman has signaled eagerness to schedule that markup as soon as the remaining sticking points close. Step 2 is merging the Banking Committee's text with the Agriculture Committee's CFTC language into a unified package for the full Senate floor. Step 3 is the full Senate floor vote, where the political dynamics are actually constructive right now. Republicans are getting direct White House pressure, and Democrats calculating their midterm positioning understand that a high-profile regulatory failure is a liability neither side wants to own publicly. Step 4 is House reconciliation, since the Senate version will differ from what the House passed, and those two texts have to be formally aligned. Step 5 is the presidential signature. The optimistic timeline puts a committee markup in the latter half of April, full Senate passage between late April and mid-May, House reconciliation shortly after, and a signature potentially by late May or early June. The measured scenario has this extending into June. What matters for you as a long-term holder is understanding that if this hasn't reached the president's desk before late summer, the political calendar starts creating genuine complications. Recess schedules, midterm positioning, and competing legislative priorities can combine to narrow windows in ways that are genuinely hard to reverse once they start working against you. The honest characterization of the mood among people close to these negotiations right now is nervous optimism, not euphoria, not despair, nervous optimism. The nervousness is legitimate. The compromise yield language has not dropped publicly yet, and in Washington, the gap between almost done and actually done has swallowed plenty of bills that looked certain, but the optimism is grounded in something real. The political capital already committed to this outcome is enormous. The White House has been leaning hard on Senate Republicans. The SEC and CFTC are already running internal preparation, which creates institutional momentum that is genuinely difficult to reverse once it reaches a certain threshold. For XRP specifically, a post-clarity regulatory environment creates structural opportunities that simply do not exist inside the current legal ambiguity. Infrastructure providers already building the rails for cross-border settlement and institutional clearing become the technical backbone that smaller financial institutions lean on when they need to offer new digital asset products, but lack the internal engineering capacity to build independently. The banks that cannot build it themselves will need to partner with someone who already has. That is the structural position that patient, informed holders in this space have been waiting to see confirmed. Think about what the moment of passage could look like if this timeline holds. Regulatory clarity entering the market at a point when global macro conditions may be stabilizing. Retail investors who have been sitting on the sidelines waiting for a reason to feel safe, suddenly having that reason handed to them by law. Institutional capital that has been locked out of certain digital asset markets due to regulatory uncertainty getting a formal green light. This is the setup that serious long-term holders have been patient enough to wait for. Here is the one signal you need to watch above everything else right now: whether the Senate Banking Committee formally announces a markup date in the coming days. A scheduled markup is not just a procedural step, it is a political commitment. Once a chairman puts a date on the calendar, walking it back becomes costly in ways that reverberate across every negotiation they are involved in. If that date gets announced, you will know the remaining gaps have closed to a level the chairman considers workable. That is your clearest near-term confirmation signal. Beyond that, watch for the yield compromise language to drop publicly. The moment that text is available, you can read exactly what each side agreed to give up. And that tells you whether the deal is structurally durable or a paper-thin compromise that could fray under the first real pressure test. Here is the bottom line. The banking opposition has shifted from existential to negotiable. The regulators are already running implementation planning internally. The political incentives on both sides of the aisle are pointing toward passage. And the window, the real window where this lands on a desk and gets signed, is measured in weeks, not years. The people who understand this moment clearly, the ones watching the markup calendar and the yield language and the regulator statements while everyone else is distracted by noise, are exactly the kind of patient, informed holders this channel was built for. You saw this before the mainstream did. That matters. Mike out.